I went to Russia right after I graduated from college with the Presbyterians. It was immediately following the fall of communism. Boris Yeltsin was president. We had a guide for most of our time in Moscow. His name was Dima. He had been in the army and was present on the day when Yeltsin climbed up on top of that tank and stared down the attempted coup against Gorbachev. Thinking back on it, I'm really a bit surprised at how candid everyone was in talking to our small group of American students. Their country was in chaos, and nobody seemed the least bit concerned about hiding the fact. As a bus took us out to the village of Istra, where we would spend a few weeks working in an orphanage for deaf children, we passed along the way fields full of what I can only describe as a shanty town. They would be considered uninhabitable by most of us, yet they were clearly inhabited. And as one looked off across the horizon, one could see the shell of large mansions being built, big, square, well-insulated houses that stood in opposition to the very obvious poverty that surrounded them. Now, it was clear that the economy was in shambles and folks were struggling, so I was intrigued by the presence of these new construction projects. So I asked Dima about them. "Oh, those belong to the mafia," he said. I must have looked stupefied because he repeated it matter-of-factly. "Yeah, the mafia." I found out later on that while we were in Istra, our passports were confiscated. I didn't realize it at the time, thankfully, but when they were allegedly checking our visas, they didn't return our passports to the minister who was the organizer for our group. The local authorities held them for a few days. "How did you get them back?" I asked after we had our passports back safely in our hands, to which he answered, "Do not ask questions that you do not want to know the answer to." Later on, as we were preparing to leave, we had planned to give a gift from our group to the school that had hosted us, and our organizer informed us that was no longer possible. The traveling money had been used. "How? Why?" we asked. "You have your passports, don't you?" she answered. It was the closest thing to the wild, wild west that I have ever experienced in my life. All law and order seemed absent. In the early days of the church, there was something of a Wild West mentality as well, or so it might have seemed to those whose religious faith had previously been well ordered. You see, with the influx of Gentiles into the common faith of the Jews and the Gentiles in Christianity, there was a whole wash of people coming into the church who had no prior background, no prior knowledge of what faith, and particularly faith practices, looked like. Now, the Jewish Christians had a strong background, but the Christians who came out of the pagan background had no frame of reference for what a Christian life might look like. And so it is that in Paul's letter to the churches that he founded, he so often seems to be correcting some type of behavior, something that might seem obvious to us now, but didn't seem at all obvious to those who were engaged in the behavior. I find that through the years, as I have read Paul's letters, I have begun becoming something of an apologist for the view that Paul said a great many things out of pure pragmatism more than out of deep theology. Now, here's an example. You've heard, perhaps, about how Paul tells women to keep their heads covered in 1 Corinthians. Now, for generations, that text and others were used to defend retrograde attitudes about women in ministry and in the church. But it happens there's a far more logical reason why Paul included that admonition. Corinth was a city that was built around its brothels. Sex workers could be identified in the streets because they let their hair down in a culture where women did not let their hair down. So Paul's common sense, pragmatic advice to the women of Corinth was, if you don't want the men on the street to assume that is your profession and to draw conclusions about the church based upon it, you might cover up your head. See the difference? Likewise, Paul has a reputation at times for being anti-LGBTQ, but I would ask you, is that a fair assessment? Or perhaps was he giving the men of Rome the same treatment he gave the women of Corinth? He wrote about a similar problem of Roman men making use of underage males and wrote to them, now maybe the Romans don't care, but let's think critically about this a second. Do you really think that Jesus approves of your using people? See why that might be an important difference? Common sense at times seems to pervade Paul's advice. A fair amount of Paul's advice was remarkably candid, open, addressing the particular issues that came up, and that advice was frequently contextual and very situationally specific to the church to which he was writing. You see, Paul drew a line in the wild, wild west mentality that was potentially the religious frontier in the years that the church was learning how to define itself in community, in a faith that was still being written in the light of Jesus Christ. Paul constantly admonished Christians to defy the culture around them in order to follow Jesus Christ. And so, in fact, while Paul's writings can be misunderstood to be stringently anti-people at times, it's hardly fair to Paul to allow a handful of clobber text cherry-picked out of context to define him, particularly given what we read from Paul to the church in Galatia. Here in this passage of Galatians that we read this morning, he clearly advocates that we not place obstacles in the way of those people seeking to live their lives in faith in Jesus Christ. Now, from time to time, the Revised Common Lectionary, which laid out this text for us today, shortens a passage. They leave out some key verses, and oftentimes I think they do it for the sake of brevity, but sometimes I think they do it to sanitize the text for us just a little bit too much. And in the juicier portion of Scripture that the lectionary omitted today, we learn that a faction within the churches associated with Galatia, which, by the way, is a rather vague geography, we really can't define what Galatia is, sought to place an unnecessary restriction on new believers in order that they could become followers of Jesus Christ. Now, here's where a little background is helpful. Because the Jewish mark of the covenant from time immemorial had been to circumcise infant males on the 8th day, a group within the Galatian church had begun to teach that all adult male converts must themselves be circumcised. Once more, Paul asks the pragmatic question: why? To what end? Actually, that's really not exactly how he puts it. It goes a little more like this: just what has gotten into you people? Do you seriously believe that God is in the business of throwing up boundaries to people's commitment to Jesus Christ? Who has been teaching you this? Because I know you sure didn't learn that from me. Paul is pretty angry in his letter to the Galatians. In the part we left out, he wraps it all up by saying, if you are so keen on cutting on people, why don't you just cut on yourselves for a while? That's the part we left out. That's the part that leads into this resounding affirmation of freedom to which Christ calls us. You see, it's not a wild, wild west freedom to which Christ calls us. It's freedom for God's people to be whom God made them to be. It's a bit amazing to me, the almost tribal need that humans seem to have to define ourselves in groups. That's what's going on in Galatia at the root of it. Folks saying, if you want to be in our group, you have to look like this. And you can insert whatever you want to in that blank, and it will be just as irrelevant today as it was then. Indeed, Paul reminds us that the whole law is summed up in the commandment to love our neighbors as ourselves. But somehow the temptation seems to remain for us to create our rules as to who can be in and who can be out, and what sort of person is appropriate and what sort of person isn't appropriate. You know, those really are just super standards that we apply on the church. You know, the only standard of membership in the church is baptism. Do you know that? You know, the disciples had their own wild, wild west moment. They wanted to take the law in their old hands also, and they seem to have forgotten what Jesus has taught them about the whole law being summed up in that one commandment. You remember what it is? Love your neighbor as yourself. So they want to take the law into their own hands as well. Jesus is working his way down to Jerusalem, which, by the way, in Luke's gospel narrative is a fatal destination. Luke goes to Jerusalem one time. Jesus goes to Jerusalem one time in Luke, and it ends in the cross. And he and his disciples encounter a Samaritan village that fails to recognize Jesus and to follow him. And so the disciples, rather glibly it seems, present Jesus with an option. Shall we rain down fire on them? They ask. Really, that's a bit extreme, don't you think? And Jesus rebuked them for it, just as Paul rebuked the Galatian Christians for seeking to impose their timeline, their expectations on these people that Jesus had just met. You see, when Paul lays out the Galatians for trying to impose super standards, he's just doing what Jesus did, applying the same understanding that Jesus offered. You know, as we read on in the gospel lesson, it seems that Jesus is having a moment of clarity about what it means to be called, what it means to follow him. And so we see in procession, in turn, people approaching Jesus, and as soon as they have the opportunity to follow, they offer their excuses. Let me go and bury my parents, one says. Now, to be fair, they were dead. No, Jesus said. Another one says, let me go and say goodbye. In other words, let me just put it off just for a minute, just for a second. I'll follow you later. No, Jesus says. And I want to be very clear about this. What is going on here is not a moment of unkindness on Jesus' part. It is a moment of clarity. Jesus is saying the same thing here in Luke that Paul will later repeat in Galatians, and it can be summed up and paraphrased this way. Get your eye on the ball. There are always going to be plenty of distractions to keep us from following Jesus Christ. Those distractions will take the form of well-intentioned other commitments, such as those proposed by Jesus' would-be followers in Luke. They're still distractions. These distractions may appear a bit more worldly, like those that Paul rather colorfully fences out. You remember the laundry list: fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. I am warning you, as I warned you before, those who do these things will not inherit the kingdom of God. That's not an ultimatum. That's an observation of truth, a fundamental truth. God doesn't stop loving us because we do bad things, but bad things certainly do keep us from loving God and following Jesus Christ. And to all of that, Paul says, for freedom, Christ has set us free. So do not take the yoke of slavery back upon yourself. This is not a wild west freedom. It is Christian freedom. That means it's not freedom as license to do whatever, whenever, and however we wish. It is freedom to live the lives that God created us to live. Lives that are marked and defined by Christ's call upon us. Now, it's a big thing to be called and claimed by Jesus Christ. Or it should be. It should be. Something's different when we're claimed by Jesus Christ. That's the point that Jesus is making. That's the point that Paul is making. It's not the external appearance that circumcision makes on the body that is important, Paul says. It's what's going on here. What's going on internally, and what that internal change makes happen on the outside. You see, what Jesus is seeking from those would-be followers, what Paul is guiding those Galatian Christians to, is the awareness that the goal of faith is not intellectual assent to being saved by Jesus. It's a way of life. And that's why circumcision is so singularly unimportant to Paul. That's why Jesus waves away those who would rather go about their business first before getting down to the business of following Jesus Christ. The goal is a whole life occupation. It's a call to a way of life. Paul, who is never short of advice, naturally has some opinions about how to live into that way of life. The fruit of the Spirit, he writes, is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against such things. That's the sort of freedom that we are called into. I want to tell you about a man named Paul Gruninger. He was a Swiss teacher who, in order to secure a better living for himself and his wife, Alice, joined the police force in his town in the 30s. And my friend Tom Long recounts his story thus. In April of 1939, Gruninger found his way to work blocked by a uniformed officer who told him, "Sir, you no longer have the right to enter these premises." An investigation revealed that Gruninger was secretly altering the documents of Jews fleeing Austria for the safety of Switzerland. Non-Aryan refugees were not allowed to cross the border after August 19th of 1938, but all it took was a few strokes of Gruninger's pen to predate a passport and perhaps save a life. It was a small action, but one with great personal risk. Well, Gruninger was dismissed from his position, ordered to turn in his uniform, and subjected to criminal charges. The authorities spread false rumors that Gruninger had demanded sexual favors from those whom he aided. And so, disgraced as a lawbreaker and shunned by his neighbors, Gruninger peddled raincoats and animal feed until he died in poverty in 1972. The interesting thing about the freedom that Christ offers us is that it's not so much freedom from, as it is freedom for the calling to make Jesus Christ a way of life, so that we may be whom God has called us to be, whom God has made us to be. Not something else, not someone else's image of who we ought to be, not some tribal grouping that says who's in and who's out for superficial reasons. For freedom Christ has set us free, so do not return to the yoke of slavery. Tom concludes his article about Paul Gruninger with these words. Theologian Arthur McGill said it is of little use to urge people to be brave or selfless. Whether people serve themselves or serve others, he said, is not in their power to choose. This is decided wholly in terms of the world in which they think they live. In New Testament terms, they live or die according to the king that holds them and the kingdom to which they belong. And it's not our version of the kingdom. It's always God's version of the kingdom. Finally, he concludes, Paul and Alice are buried together near St. Gallen. 70 years later, a plaque was placed at the foot of Paul's grave. It reads, Paul Gruninger saved hundreds of refugees in 1938 and 39. At his funeral, the choir sang, Nearer, my God, to thee. And a rabbi read from the Talmud, He who saves a single life saves the entire world. That's a way of life.